So I'm going to just explain a little bit about ethos and then kind of riff off that in relationship to what I'm going to talk about in terms of character, because ethos basically refers to the distinctive character or spirit of a community or culture. It goes beyond the kind of extraordinary kind of ethics that, or dilemma ethics that people often talk about, that focus on hard decisions, to actually try and look at the ordinary, the everyday, the aspects of culture and community building. And ethos could also be an acronym for every evangelical theology of society. We haven't talked about that as much, but that's certainly very much the kind of under the tip of the iceberg kind of thing that's the presuppositions for everything we do in terms of a sort of evangelical deepening of our roots in the reconciling, peacemaking gospel and work of Christ. So that's fundamental in terms of what we do. Now, what's the relevance of that to what we're talking about tonight? I want to talk about developing a Christian kind of ethos at work, or Christian character at work, and I want to talk about that both in terms of individuals and institutions, because it can operate at both levels. And I want to talk about professionalism in some ways and the relationship between that and our profession of faith. So a fairly classic sort of definition of profession is a group that's primarily pursuing a learned art as a common calling in the spirit of public service, which also may incidentally be a means to a livelihood. That's handy to have that as well. But I also want to link that with a passage from Scripture, and there are several passages that refer to profession, and the origins of the term profession in our culture do actually go back to Scripture. So just one of several says, "Since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, let us hold fast to our profession." Now, with Brian Rosner here, I want to be fairly careful that I don't stretch that too far. But that's certainly, in the Hebrews context, in the context of persecution, and in their particular context, it was a sort of pressures to return to Judaism in some ways. But I would want to say that the idea of holding fast to our profession is a critical one. And if we're to talk about an area in life these days, certainly in the Western world where Christians may feel most under pressure, we don't have the kind of persecution that you might find in the Middle East or places like that. But the workplace is an area where there are certainly major issues for Christians, where they face some similar temptations to perhaps de-identify as Christians or be very sort of secretive about that. And so I think there's an importance for us to see what are the ways we can reconnect both with the original roots of the term profession, but also in terms of the practices of professions, which basically arose out of the monastic movement. Even in what's called the Dark Ages, you've always got to be careful. I used to teach my students in church history about periodisation in history. You know, the Enlightenment, that's when the lights came out. So, came on. Everything else, the lights were out. The Dark Ages, or medieval, where people spell it with an E-V-I-L. So we need to be careful about some of those things. There are a lot of good things that actually came out during the Dark Ages, and the origins of the professions, and the classic professions, things like theology, law, medicine, etc., they're actually very built into the very framework, the buildings of medieval monasteries. I saw one in Boston last year in Yorkshire, and magnificent kind of place with all this kind of people in charge of hospitality, etc., medicine, a wide range of things. In terms of the purpose or the end of a profession, Dean Roscoe found that a profession has a specialised body of knowledge, whether that's engineering or whatever, commitment to the social good, that seems to sometimes be forgotten these days, ability to self-regulate, that's sometimes forgotten too, high social status, that high social status depends very much on social trust. And you can sometimes look at the sort of lists of what are the most trusted professions these days. I think probably medicine, maybe nurses are trusted more than doctors, I think, in some rankings. Clergy have gone down considerably in recent times, but it's interesting to look at some of the kind of loss of trust in relationship to the professions. A profession also has a specific social good, so that it has a sense of and seeks that social good. Each profession does so according to their particular training and expertise. So doctors as health, for instance, engineers as safe structures, social workers as care and justice, for instance. Now, they can be nuanced in various ways. But I think we often talk very vaguely about the good, because I would want to say in terms of different spheres of creation and the different spheres of culture, there are quite specific goods according to the practices of particular professions. And it's really important that those professions continue to seek those particular goods as their kind of purpose or end. Now, that doesn't deny that there is a sense of not just role morality, but also real morality or universal morality, I would say creation-based reality that professions still need to be accountable to. Professions shouldn't be so tunnel-visioned that they just say, well, I'm just focused on my patient, or I am just focused on this particular kind of thing. Or, in the case of psychiatrists, and I know there's at least one here tonight, in LA, there was a famous case where someone in the counselling setting said that they were going to kill their wife. And the counsellor, under the kind of privacy aspects in terms of that, in terms of psychiatrists' ethics, basically didn't do anything about that. The wife was killed. The American Psychiatric Association had their socks sewed off, and they soon changed their mind. And I'm not normally in favour of the sort of, sue or be sued kind of culture in the States, but it can have profound effects, because they had forgotten that we have multiple roles. They are also citizens. We're also neighbours, and there's a duty of care not only to your immediate client, but sometimes beyond that. And there are complications of those things we see in terms of the abuse crisis, issues of confession, for instance, that have been raised, and mandatory reporting. So there's a tension and a kind of balance that has to be had between those particular goods of a particular profession, but also that broader role that professionals have as well. Professionals ought to ask what sort of person I ought to be and what sort of professional should I be, but also, more broadly, what sort of community will I help create and contribute to the common good in that way. And let me say, from a biblical angle, in 1 Corinthians 5, where a high-status person, one of the strong in Corinth, is shacked up with their stepmother. He's sleeping with their stepmother, and Paul says, well, this is even the pagans don't do this. And some of the critiques of Christians in recent times and Christian professionals in relationship to the abuse issues has not been that Christians are sort of having this really demanding ethic, or perhaps we still had the demanding ethic, but the practice had been so low, it was lower than perhaps the last absolute of secular society, which is you do not abuse, particularly you don't abuse kids. So, at the very least, we need to be very careful we're not actually getting lower than the wider society. And we ought to recognise, in a secular society, people are made in the image of God, and often they have a lot to teach us. And so we need to be careful that our practice is at least as good as theirs. Now, how does this pan out in action? Now, I realise this is a complex diagram, but as Wilma said to me, she tried to read Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, as many people have tried to read, which is probably the most significant book in ethics since the 1980s, and where MacIntyre laments the loss of character or virtue ethics. And I've basically reduced his basic statement down to one diagram. If you think this is overly complex, it was a lot worse than this before my wife got to it, so helping me try and fix it up. Now, what MacIntyre talks about is basically that we should aim at producing a certain form of character and virtue, and that is the internal good of a social practice. Now, I'm wanting to say that for Christians generally, and I'm trying to apply this, let's say, to education and welfare being two main areas that Christians are involved in our wider society, of a kind of integration in witness. Now, I would want to say that is a broad sense of witness or mission that includes social justice as well as profession of Christ, and there will be different ways in which that happens in different kind of contexts. So that is the basic internal good, which happens within a social practice. Now, a social practice can be something like education or welfare, for instance, in a particular society, which happens within an institutional context. Now, institutional contexts could include government, business, bureaucracy, hospitals, schools, etc., which will have their own kind of professional standards in various ways, and they will be subject to certain external goods. So external goods are things like bums on seats, how many the throughput of people and clients, your financial situation, your reputation, what affects your advertising, etc., etc. It's those sorts of external goods that are things that very often that are meant to be means, very often become ends in themselves. Max Dupree, who set up, it was set up in his name at Fuller. He was one of the best business people in Australia. At Fuller Seminary, where I did my doctorate, I was there for the opening of the Dupree Centre. And Max Dupree always said that his profit is like breathing. We live to breathe. We breathe to live. We don't live to breathe. The profit is the means. The finances are the means. Those other sorts of things, having a good reputation, etc., is part of that. A reputation may reflect character, but good spin on a reputation isn't exactly the same as character, and it's critical to realise that. How do we work within the tension between the internal goods of character, the kinds of things we're wanting to reflect to people, the kind of profession of Christ that we're wanting to display in relationship to certain virtues, care, justice, etc., patience, all of those sorts of things, faith, hope and love. How do we hold on to those things and maintain those and maintain our profession in relationship to those things? And I'd want to say with MacIntyre, we do it through a very strong sense of story or narrative and tradition. Now, we're not talking about traditionalism, but tradition as an ongoing argument. That's the definition that MacIntyre has, that we're always asking, well, how do we adapt and update this in time and space and in different social contexts? How do we do that, including those institutional contexts that we're in? And we need to work out how we're going to express that effectively. So those arrows are moving in both directions. So there's a two-way process going on. And to use, it's the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, so semper reformanda, always reforming. Always reforming is a process that we have to be engaged in constantly in order to maintain our honesty under the kind of pressures that we're often under. They can be secularisation pressures, privatisation of welfare, education, etc. How do we maintain our profession in relationship to that story, and how do we maintain that distinctive character of Christ in the midst of those sorts of pressures? Let me mention one particular case of massive failure. And I was hoping to show you a clip, but my digital dinosaur skills meant I wasn't able to show you this. But Daniel Blake. Many people have seen that that movie. Wilma has. That's good. If you haven't, it's on. I think it's on DVD. Basically, it's available these days. It's a wonderful movie. It's a Ken Loach movie, and I love Ken Loach movies. And it got the Palme d'Or at Cannes. And it's about a man called Daniel Blake. And Daniel Blake he's 59 and he's had a heart attack. He's a carpenter and he's a real battler. And it's about his struggles with the UK welfare system. This is based on sort of spies that Loach had within that system. And in the midst of critiques of some of what he's said, it seems that their testimony is held up pretty well. It's like Centrelink's clumsy and heartless attempts to verify the benefits received by clients, and the overly sort of over-trust in technology that was involved in those incredibly clumsy and fairly heartless processes, which they'd actually been warned about, apparently, the weaknesses within those systems. And apparently some aspects of the new budget will reinforce some of those. And there were stories about threatening letters, technologically mandated withdrawal of payments before clients even had a chance to prove the details of their circumstances. One particularly rough report was of a 63-year-old Norfolk Islander amputee who was told to look for employment as a cab driver. There are no cabs on Norfolk Island. Then as a gaming attendant. There are no casinos either. Or as a security guard. There's not a big demand for one-legged security guards. And it goes on and on. And what there's no regard to his particular condition, which also included a recent heart attack. So the parallels with Daniel Blake are very strong. The answer of the ironically named Federal Department of Human Services was this is a quote, the local labour market does not have a bearing on legislative ability to work criteria. So this is the problem when you have bureaucracy and sometimes a kind of abstract notion of Enlightenment ethics in terms of equality that simply doesn't have any of the, let's say, the postmodern kind of sensitivity to context, for instance, or basic Christian sensitivity to the dignity of humanity and particular people. Now, the movie Daniel Blake basically goes into great detail about that particular situation and the situation of a friend that he makes who's a young widow who finds herself at certain points reduced to prostitution in order to be able to try and feed her kids. And she'd been starving herself, basically. There's an incredibly moving moment where she goes to a church-based food pantry and is actually treated with great love and dignity in that context. For Ken Loach, who's a fairly hard-bitten Marxist, that was a nice touch. That he recognised that, and that's the kind of thing that we ought to aspire to. And having been a few times to Britain, since it's very hard-edged kind of economic policies in recent times, you see masses and masses of church-based food pantries and that on the streets there. Let me just give you a few quick questions that you could go away with to think about. This is an ethics audit worksheet, and this is written by one of the kind of narrative ethicists in the line of McIntyre. And if you want to have a character, you've got to have a narrative. You have to have a story. It's not something you can just produce out of yourself. And these questions we've used a lot in teaching at Macquarie School of Applied Finance, which I've done with Chris White, who's here tonight. When your organisation or company was founded, what key events or changes were taking place in your industry? What have happened since? How have they affected you and your organisation's ethics? What have been the critical turning points in its history? Sorry, I think I jumped one there. Actually, I won't worry. Time's getting short. What characteristics or virtues... Oh, here we go. What differences did those turning points make? What impact did they make on its values? What themes or patterns do you discern in your organisation's history or story, which are successful and which are, inverted commas, failures? Which individuals most impacted your organisation's story? Who are its saints, its heroes, or role models? Think of Apple and Steve Jobs. Not personally, I think the most admirable person. I'm not particularly enamored with Apple when their work practices in China lead to people jumping off roofs, and the solution to that is that you put netting around the roofs so people won't suicide. You don't cut back the hours. I was there when they advertised 100,000 jobs in another state. They just moved their premises and shut down. Foxconn was the name of their supplier. What characteristics or virtues did they display? What traditions, practices or rituals does your organisation and profession practice? Are they respected? What things do you reward? What are your hiring and firing policies? What things would you like to change? What new practices or rituals would you introduce? Let me just finish with a quick story. One group that heard me talking about this was a Catholic order from Adelaide, and they said, oh, that's actually what we do. They said, because this must have been the days when you had more supply of nurses, but they said we would hire the people who knew that we were founded by Mary Potter in the 1890s in order to show Christ's compassion to the dying and the poor. And not just people who had happened to have looked at the website, but people who had taken it on board. It was clear that they strongly identified with those values. And that was how they were able to replicate and reproduce that story and that tradition and embody it in their practices. I'll say more about Wilma, but she's the person who's done that and has urged people to do that in a range of different contexts. But that's one of the main reasons why we've given her the award for this year. But it's enough from me now.